Hello, and welcome to this joint meeting of the museum's history and genealogy groups. We greet participants joining us on Zoom, as well as those on Facebook Live. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Harriet Pierce, and I am the coordinator of the Barbados Genealogy Group. Today we welcome Luke Delmas, who will give us a glimpse of the goldsmith trade in Barbados during the long 18th century. And to introduce him, I now invite the museum's curator of social history and community engagement, Dr. Natalie McGuire, who is also the coordinator of the history group. Natalie?
Thank you, Harriet. Good afternoon, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Luke Delmas. Luke Delmas was born and educated in Barbados, completing an MPhil in chemistry at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. He subsequently completed his PhD in chemistry at Imperial College London, where he is now a senior teaching fellow. Outside his teaching career, Luke is an avid silver collector and researcher and co-leads a Silver Society project that aims to compile current research on the goldsmith trade of the Caribbean during the 18th and 19th centuries into an edited book. As Harriet mentioned, Luke is he's giving a presentation on glimpses of the goldsmith trade in Barbados during the long 18th century and has shared an abstract as follows. During the long 18th century, profits from the sugar industry in Barbados resulted in a local demand for European luxury goods, with Bridgetown's natural harbour becoming a key trading hub in the region. The prospering planters and merchants furnished their homes both for comfort and to display their wealth. Travelers' accounts of hospitality and surviving probate inventories evidence the fact that silver was part of this endeavour. While imported wares dominated the retail market, Bridgetown also became home to numerous working goldsmiths and jewelers. These artisans were engaged in manufacturing new wares when supplies from Europe were interrupted and repairing worn or damaged pieces. The present study uses archival and genealogical sources to explore how the Barbadian goldsmiths trade operated during the long 18th century, who the artisans were, and how they marketed themselves. So far, over 100 members of the trade have been identified between 1688 and 1815. Comparison of this register of workers to a group of previously unattributed silver objects, each marked with its maker's initials, has allowed for tentative attributions to Barbados of several surviving pieces. Welcome, Luke. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Harriet and Natalie, for the kind introductions, and thank you to the Barbados Museum for the invitation to speak today. I'll jump right in because I have a lot to say and not so much time. This talk actually builds on a presentation I gave in summer last year on Caribbean silver, the first of its kind, held at Goldsmiths Hall in London. And this brought together all of the research happening, some of the research happening concerning the goldsmith trade in the West Indies islands, and was also a celebration of the life and work of the late Robert Barker, who was an independent scholar with a strong interest in this area. And Robert published his work on the goldsmiths of Jamaica, and in his will left a generous gift to the Silver Society, which is an educational charity based in the UK, to encourage further research into this area of the West Indies goldsmiths trade. And so if anyone's interested in hearing more about the grants that are available through this bequest, please do get in touch after the talk today. The talk I'm going to give today then is focused largely on the urban centre of Bridgetown, recognising the diversity of artisanal trades present there over the centuries. But we're going to focus today on just one of those trades, which is that of the goldsmiths. And I'm going to use the term goldsmith throughout the presentation to refer collectively to the related trades of goldsmith, silversmith, and jeweller. There's huge overlap between these areas, and more so even in smaller colonial town centres. And so I wanted to start before jumping into the results of this project, just to give a bit of an introduction to silver, because perhaps not everyone's coming from a collecting background like I am, but at one point or another, I'm sure we've all come across objects made from silver, whether that's tea services or candlesticks, it might be christening presents or cutlery to eat with, or maybe reference to historical items, like in the top right-hand side of this slide, the silver nutmeg grater. Nutmeg, of course, being holding social significance in the long 18th century. And I just wanted to make one distinction because there are two common types of silver we come across. The first, more common and more affordable, of course, is silver plate, which is where you have an object made of a base metal core, usually some alloy of copper or nickel, and overlaid on that base metal is a very, very thin layer of pure silver that gives the appearance then of a silver object, but much more cheaply. And so you might come across articles bearing the mark EPNS, and that stands for electroplated nickel silver. The focus of today's presentation, however, is on objects made from sterling silver. So this is a solid silver alloy with at least a 92.5% silver content, and it's this alloy that's present throughout the object. So it's no longer a coating, the entire object is made of silver. And this makes it very much more expensive, and so a much more luxurious item and a sort of status symbol, as we'll see. And so if you're spending money buying objects made of sterling silver, you want to know they're of appropriate quality. And that's been the role of the Goldsmith company in the United Kingdom over the last 700 years to provide assurance and guarantee of the quality of silver objects. And so nothing can be sold in the UK unless it's been hallmarked, which shows that it's been tested and proven to be of sufficient quality. And when we talk about something being hallmarked, we're talking about the application of these marks, these impressions on the object being offered for sale. And so in the top left of this slide, you can see it looks like a gold ring there being marked. And so the assayer is holding a steel punch with the engraving of the mark to be applied. They strike that punch with a hammer and it forms that impression on the object. And so on the bottom left of this slide, you can see a gravy ladle, and it bears London hallmarks that tell us quite a lot. It gives us quite a lot of provenance about the object. So starting from the rightmost mark, you can see an upside down GA. That signifies that this piece was submitted by the goldsmith George Adams for assay. And so it's helpful then that that maker's mark uses the maker's initials, and that's going to be really important, as we'll see in this study. Working our way towards the left, you can see a little lion. That tells us that the object has met the minimum sterling standard, so it's at least 92.5% silver. The leopard's head tells us it was assayed in London. The Gothic S, that it was submitted in the year 1857. And Queen Victoria's head signifies that duty was paid on the silver in this case. So while customers buying silver may not have understood the intricacies of this marking system, they would know to understand that seeing these marks on silver meant that silver was of an appropriate quality. And so that's an important aspect. But now back to Barbados. How does this luxury trade develop in Barbados? Why is silver such an important part of colonial Barbadian society? So I think most people on this call would be familiar with the fact that Barbados was a major sugar economy built on a plantation system that was driven by the labor of enslaved people. By the end of the 17th century, that sugar industry was so successful that from all of the exports, you actually had an export value more than the total exports of all of the continental colonies at this time. And that relative position of exports changes, but the key thing is that there was money coming in to the local planters and, of course, also the merchants that were operating in Barbados at this time and beyond. So what these nouveau riche families wanted to do then was to establish their place as sort of elite on the island. And so part of this was them seeking to emulate the material culture of well-heeled families in Britain. And part of that endeavor was actually buying and displaying silver and using silver in entertaining. So we have this lovely quote from a visiting French priest, Father Anton Bier, who visited Barbados in the middle of the 17th century and noted of the inhabitants he met that they came here to be wealthy, so it was all about the pursuit of success. And while there, they lived like little princes, wearing gold watches and enjoying the most extravagant luxuries from England and elsewhere, all to be found in the island's well-stocked shops. And so this is important because this is telling us that by the middle of the 17th century, there was already this commercial center in the towns established, that you could actually go to shops and buy luxury items imported from Europe. And so we do find archival evidence for goldsmiths existing at this period, and indeed silver is noted on contemporaneous inventories also. And here's one of those early inventories. So this is the inventory of Francis Russell, who was governor of Barbados from 1694 to 1696. And it's an inventory of the silver that's being shipped back to his executors in England following his death. And these are just some excerpts. It's a much longer list, but we can see here an early example of a silver teapot. We can see various dishes and a silver mug, salt cellars, cutlery, candlesticks, and so on. So the elite governor then is having silver. And so in terms of the implications socially, anyone else who was aspiring to kind of rise in their success and status in the island would have wanted to emulate this and also have, use, and display silver. And possession of even a few objects of silver would have denoted some kind of higher social standing. Silver was also a means, of course, of storing wealth because of the bullion value, essentially. It was a precious metal that you were storing in the form of objects. And this is just another example of silver that appears in an inventory. So this is a later, early 19th century inventory for Hannah Gill, and several different silver objects are mentioned on that inventory, ranging from a tea service to cutlery. And so this is silver that would have been used in entertaining and would have signaled Hannah's success. So now at the year 1700, we have another set of wonderful quotes. So we have another visiting French priest, Father Labat. He visits the island in 1700 and writes beautifully about Bridgetown. He describes Bridgetown as beautiful and noble, with everything appearing to have an atmosphere of tidiness, civility, and wealth, which one doesn't see in all of the other islands. And so he's here distinguishing Barbados as the civilized island among those that he's visited. And he mentions that one notices the opulence and good taste of the inhabitants in their magnificent furniture and silver, of which they all have considerable quantities. So again, by 1700, there's clearly sufficient silver being used on the island that is worthy of note. And again, reference to shops and merchants' warehouses, signaling that commercial trade that was going on in the town, where these shops were filled with all you could wish for from all parts of the world. So the fact that Labat in that quote is referencing silver being imported from all parts of the world is signaling to us that transatlantic shipping trade is very, very important. And that makes sense because a lot of today's talk is essentially focused on Bridgetown, because you have Carlisle Bay offering its protection as a natural harbour. And also Barbados's easterly position means this was, of course, one of the first stops on those transatlantic journeys where merchants could then offload stock and offer them for sale. We can see evidence of that very strong maritime activity in period paintings, like this well-known one here of the governor going to church. And if you just look beyond the land into that harbour, you can see the amount of ships, and that's signaling to us a very, very kind of active maritime trade. This later 19th century painting gives us an idea of how then smaller boats brought both people and cargo ashore, and we can get a glimpse of some of those merchant warehouses and shops that then were destined to receive that cargo. And while these photographs are much later of Bridgetown, I think it gives a sense of the streetscape of what we're talking about. So these very typical properties, which would have had their shops on the lower ground floor level, and then often residences upstairs. And some of these shops, of course, would have been those of the jewelers, goldsmiths, watchmakers, and so on. So what I'm describing so far is what we get the impression is a very, very active retail trade. And to look at a snapshot of how that retail trade had developed over the 18th century, we can look at some of the early 19th century Barbadian newspapers where retailing goldsmiths are advertising goods for sale. And so I've just brought two of those advertisements onto this slide as an example. On the left, we have a Jewish jeweler, Benjamin Elkin, advertising imported goods for sale, both jewelry and silver. And it's interesting that he emphasizes in this advertisement that he's imported these goods which are warranted the latest court fashions and collected from the most eminent jewelers in London. So this is appealing to his customers' desire to have the latest fashions, to be right up to the times with goods that would be being bought also in London. And he's emphasizing that he's not just bringing in these things from England, he's gone to the most reputable dealers, and so they really are getting the best of the best in Bridgetown. And the advertisement describes a huge selection of jewelry and personal adornments, as well as more utilitarian silver that you'd use then at the table. It's interesting, and this may be a unique case. I haven't come across another example yet. Benjamin Elkin actually registers a mark at Goldsmiths Hall in London, but I don't think he's making anything at all. Rather, we see this fork here, which was found in Barbados, bearing the mark of Benjamin Elkin, but you can see that his mark is overstriking another. So what's happening here is that Benjamin Elkin is importing silver into Barbados, overstriking it with his mark, because that's what he's offering his customers the assurance of. It's his reputation that he's known to be able to provide these high quality items, even if he isn't making them himself. The advertisement on the right is another merchant, John Niles, again offering a similar range of objects for sale. But it's interesting that at the end of that advertisement, he is calling in his customers to come and settle their accounts. And so it's telling us that at least part of this luxury trade is operating on a credit basis. And so personal reputation and financial trust is therefore very, very important here. It's a small society. Everyone's going to know everyone, even more so than today. And so it's interesting that you see that credit system operating. So these are just two advertisements, but all of the advertisements I've seen, when you kind of consider them en masse, suggest that notable amounts of silver were clearly being imported into the island. But do we have any more data to support that? And I was able to find a publication by the House of Commons showing the wrought silver being exported to foreign countries from Great Britain in the year 1801. And what we can see from the tallest bar on that chart, which corresponds to the silver being exported to the British West Indies Islands, is that, well, it's the tallest one on that chart. And so it really is a very important trade. This is nearly 30,000 troy ounces of silver being exported in just 1 year. So it really was a valuable market, and clearly a very successful retail trade on the islands, including Barbados. We know these merchants are operating, we know they're selling things, but how did that trade work? How did these merchants source goods from overseas? We found evidence of two different methods. So the first is by placing orders through West India merchants or ships' captains, so using intermediaries, or otherwise placing orders directly with suppliers in Britain. So evidence of the first can be found in a surviving billhead for John Kentish, who is a London-based retailer of luxury goods, including silver. And the customer listed on this bill are Messrs. Inez and Hope, who are West India merchants based in London. So from this bill, it's not clear what island specifically these goods were destined for, but the fact that the customer was a West India merchant means it was coming to one of the islands. And so if we think about the implications of that in terms of the supply chain, if we start, let's say in Barbados, just as an example, with a retail customer then on the island who approaches a local retailer in town and says, I want, let's say, I don't know, a silver tea set or something, that retailer based in the West Indies has then approached a West India merchant based in London, who's gone to a retailer, John Kentish, who doesn't make anything. So he then has to outsource the order to working manufacturers in the UK. And at every step of that chain, you have markups, you have transportation costs, insurance costs. And so by the time these goods reached the West Indies, they would have been incredibly expensive. This clearly, didn't matter too much in the sense of clearly there was a successful trade to be had, but it begs the question, does that then open an opportunity for a local goldsmith to produce wares locally and able to then undercut that supply chain and offer goods more cheaply? A local goldsmith would also be able to repair worn out items, to supply orders at short notice, especially when shipping was interrupted due to bad weather or wars and so on. And so we'll return to that question later, this special market for working artisans. But let's return our attention to that bill I was showing you. Here are the details of what was actually on that order. And what we can see is various replicate orders for sets of spoons and ladles and so on. And this isn't the kind of order that would have been for one person, because no one would need all of these duplicate orders. This was clearly a retailer that was ordering goods on speculation so that they could have stock to offer their customers. But item number 6 is unique on this bill because it also includes a charge for the engraving of crests and mottos. So this is suggesting then that item 6 was for a specific customer who had placed a special order, because that individual's coat of arms that this crest and motto would have been associated with have been engraved onto the silver, so it's personalized for that individual. So overall, these retailers on the island would have been buying goods both on speculation, but also fulfilling special requests from local customers. There's a surviving co-partnership deed. That's the other mechanism, which is the direct relationship with a manufacturer in Britain. This survives in the National Maritime Museum in Liverpool, and it speaks to an agreement between Robert Preston, who's a silversmith based in Liverpool, and Henry Madden, who's a merchant based in Barbados. And essentially, Preston receives the commission for organizing the goods and sending them down. And then once the goods sell, the net profits are split between the two. So a slightly different model of sourcing the goods and cutting out some of those intermediaries. Were any silver objects actually being made on the island? I've alluded to the fact that there clearly was this opportunity, but was there actually an active trade of people manufacturing objects on the island? We go back to Father Labat and we see this amazing quote, which is very helpful, where he says, one sees many goldsmiths, jewelers, clock and watchmakers, and other workmen who have a lot of work and who seem to be very comfortable carrying on one of the largest trades in the Americas. So Labat here is not referring to retailers, but working artisans. Can we find any more evidence than this? There's a transcript of a trial held at the Old Bailey in London concerning James Cray, who was robbed of a watch, a seal, and some silver buckles. And the judge asked Cray, are these buckles the buckles you were robbed of? And Cray says, in no uncertain terms, yes, my lord, they are foreign make. I had them made in Barbados. So there we have it in black and white. Silver objects absolutely were being made in Barbados. And so that's then the basis for this project, is trying to find out more about them and their work. So through archival research, we've assembled a list of just over 100 names of goldsmiths, and that's through various sources. The Barbados Mercury has been a fantastic source, but also wills, inventories, levy books, and so on. And we recognize that this list of names is going to be a combination of goldsmiths who are just retailing, but also some subset of that list is going to be working goldsmiths who are making things and marking them. And so by looking into each of these artisans, we get little glimpses into how this trade operated as this project progresses. The first of those case studies is Matthias Hulse. Matthias Hulse is a jeweler that was actually born in London to parents of Danish extraction. And at some point, and I'm not sure exactly when, he comes down to Barbados, possibly when he marries his wife, Elizabeth. and carries on his trade as jeweler and goldsmith in Bridgetown. For those of you who are actually familiar with this name, it's likely because he publishes a series of almanacs starting in the year 1755. And these almanacs seem to then be carried on after his death by his children, Matthias Holst, his namesake, and also his daughter, and Margaret Holst. What's most interesting is on the inside cover of the 1765 almanac, we get quite a bit of detail of Holst's operation as a goldsmith. So it lists Matthias Holst as jeweler, goldsmith, and toyman, late of Lancaster Court, Charing Cross, London, but now at the Pine and Pearl in Cheapside, Bridgetown. And so an interesting point here, that Pine and Pearl almost certainly corresponds to what would have been on his shop sign. We're at a time when we don't have a high literacy rate, and so actually having that pictorial symbolism on shop signs was very important. And many thanks to my AI companion who has sketched for us what that street scene outside of Matthias Holst's shop might have looked like. Just to note, anywhere where I've used an AI image, or just a small handful, have included that symbol on the bottom right of that image. But more importantly, returning to that advertisement on the inside of the almanac, in the advertisement, Holst is noted to make all sorts of jewelers and goldsmiths work. So again, we have it in black and white there that he is making things and has the skills to make objects in gold and silver. But he also imports the most fashionable goods from London. And so I think that's a really important archetype that we see repeated across various artisans, that the larger artisans who have a shop are operating a hybrid model of both making things but also importing goods for sale to supplement what they might be able to make. They can keep a much wider range of stock by supplementing their manufacture with imported goods. So we know that there's going to be a workshop associated with Holst, but where's the labor coming from for what are a very specialized set of skills required to work in silver and gold? We find records suggesting that Holst took 2 apprentices from Christ's Hospital, London, via the goldsmith Samuel Eaton of Wood Street, London. And so this is one avenue for recruiting and training laborers to take on apprentices. Apprenticeships last around 7 years, and so Holst would have trained these people up then to work with him. Another source of labor, of course, is indentured servants. And so the earliest mention of a silversmith indenture I've seen coming from Britain is the last quarter of the 17th century, but here we have an example for John Williams, an indenture contract dated 1721, where Williams is bound to serve with the goldsmith John Newlyn of Barbados for 4 years at £28 per annum. It's further agreed in this contract that Williams will teach in his capacity of working goldsmith any servants belonging to Newlyn. And so I think this is an interesting paradigm shift here where we're perhaps questioning the sustainability of continually importing kind of labor from overseas. But if Newlyn was able to safeguard the labor force internally by having this chain of skill succession of artisans training each other within the workshop, that would make a lot of economic sense. And so it's perhaps not surprising that we also come across reference to the use of labor from enslaved artisans. And so we know very, very little about the enslaved goldsmiths because we really only see mention of them in runaway advertisements in the newspaper. In these advertisements, the language is still showing a transactional treatment of these people, not dissimilar from what we're seeing in the rural slavery settings. But clearly, these are very, very important artisans to the trade. And it means that the objects coming out of these workshops are the products of several hands. Yet what little we know is centered at the minute on the proprietor. So I think this is a really important part of this project, to try and uncover as much as we can about these invisible artisans and to tell their stories. These 2 advertisements on the screen are runaway notices. The first on the left, placed by Henrietta Mellor, who is the widow of the goldsmith Jacob Mellor, and she seeks to dispose of, as she puts it, 2 valuable goldsmiths. So recognizing that this very specialized skill set was in short supply and of value. Thomas Burton provides the name of the enslaved goldsmith Content, and he forbids any person from employing him. And so again, I think this is telling us a little bit about just how in demand the skill set would have been in Bridgetown, and therefore how valuable these artisans were. The third and final advertisement I've come across that concerns enslaved artisans is this notice placed by the Jewish silversmith Isaac Lopez, who was operating on Church Street for a runaway artisan called Gift, who's noted by Lopez to be well known about this town and country. And I found that really interesting because I think I had naively thought of these artisans as being restricted to working in the workshop of the proprietors. And actually, this is suggesting a wider engagement with the trade across the town. And so I think there's suggestion here then of some amount of mobility of these artisans. Gift is very well dressed in waistcoat and breeches, clearly very valuable based on the size of the reward being offered for his return. And I think, again, coming back to the shortage of this specialized skill, it was likely that these artisans were afforded opportunities for outworking. And this would have provided some possibility for some level of financial accumulation, whether that allowed just slightly improving conditions of life, or perhaps with saving enough, the possibility and that glimmer of hope of buying one's freedom. And so that kind of then brings us in to another aspect that needs to be more fully explored, which is the role of freed artisans in these skilled trades. So manumitted artisans would have continued in the skilled occupations that they performed while enslaved. And an American visiting Barbados in the early 19th century notes that free people of color carried on all of the light and mechanical trades. So these trades were dominated by freed artisans of color, including those of the jeweler and the associated goldsmith trade. Yet to date, I've only come across one reference to a free goldsmith of color, and that's William Nunez, who has been listed in the will of freedman William Newton as a free mulatto goldsmith that inherits Newton's house. So there are going to be many more of these names that we should come across in time, because I think certainly by the beginning of the 19th century, these artisans are going to be dominating the manufacturing trade. So what the last few slides have established is that we do have a group of these artisans working in Bridgetown making things. And so then the search begins to find what work might survive that comes out of these workshops. And so I began this part of the project by visiting private silver collections in Barbados to see what I could find. It's very easy to spot English objects because they're all fully hallmarked and you can spot them right away. But there was then this group of silver that was emerging, largely flatware, many spoons, which were at the time unattributed. They were appearing to be English in style, so clearly were being made somewhere of English influence, engraved in an English manner with the marriage initials of the owners, and marked just with a maker's mark several times. And to me, that made sense that you were working in a place that didn't have an assay office, that didn't have laws that said everything needed to be hallmarked, but you wanted to give your customer that reassurance of the quality you were providing. And so just striking your maker's initials several times gave that appearance of hallmarks that people were expecting. And we have to remember that we were in a society where people were also buying imported silver, so they knew to expect some kind of markings on the silver. And so I then began to create a register of these unattributed works and draw comparisons to that list of names that we had from the archival research. And so this is possible because of that format of using the maker's initial on that maker's mark punch. So I'm now going to present some of the attributions that we've been able to make so far, hopefully more in the pipeline. But I've come across in the late 18th century 2 Horsham goldsmiths, so Samuel Maynard Horsham and William Horsham. And they placed independent advertisements in the Barbados Mercury but both suggesting that they're capable of making objects. So the advertisement on the left for Samuel Maynard Horsham advertises his desire to purchase quite a large quantity of gold and silver, so likely to use as raw materials to make objects. William Horsham advertises his taking a shop at the house of Mr. Edward Gaskin Thomas. And importantly, he assures his customers that those that favour him for their work can depend on having their work well finished. So again, sort of making it very clear in that advertisement that he's a working goldsmith. They're also retailing. So we come back to that archetype of being hybrid makers and retailers. And so in these advertisements, which I don't expect you to read in the short time I'm showing them, both Horsham Goldsmiths are advertising imported goods from London. And they're advertising essentially the same stock. It's a mixture of jewellery and personal adornments and tableware, including cruet stands and spoons, nutmeg graters, and so on. So this huge range of stock they're offering would be beyond, there are too many specialist skills involved in each of those items. And so they're able to offer this wide range that would have expanded beyond their individual skill sets. So it is a good model to operate. What's the connection between these two? Well, this is when we then turn to the genealogical research, and special thanks to Ernest Murcott Wiltshire, who has been helping me with this. He's also working on a genealogical database that I understand ultimately will be available through the museum. But we've had to make some assumptions along the way, because earlier generations of these Horshams were based in St. Peter and St. Lucy, where the records are a bit more patchy. We made some assumptions, but this is what we end up with. We believe that Samuel and William are second cousins, so sharing a great grandfather in Captain Samuel Horsham. And both William and Samuel are, of course, operating in St. Michael. What about some silver? I've been talking an awful lot, but I haven't shown you much silver. So this is a spoon that was found in Barbados. It is an English style. This is known as the Old English pattern, and it's decorated with some engraving along the perimeter of its handle, known as bright cut decoration, wrigglework decoration, and it's marked on the back with 3 stamps of a mark WH. And so we propose here and attribute this mark to William Horsham. We've come across other examples of WH marks on very similar spoons. Again, these spoons date stylistically from exactly the right time when William Horsham is working in Barbados. These are slightly different punches for the WH mark, but we expect that as these punches, which are made of steel, rust and wear out, that indeed these artisans have to then cut new punches ever so often, and so we would expect to see a variety of marks for one maker. And you can see clear evidence of that in the marks on the bottom right of this slide, where you can see there's a defect in the punch. There's a whole kind of chunk of that impression missing. And that's very clearly where the steel has rusted and broken away. And so you're getting that repeat defect across all the marks. But so these are other examples of spoons being made by William Horsham in Bridgetown, Barbados. Moving along to another firm, in the newspapers of 1783, we see various notices for a firm of Smithson and James, and they advertise London imported silverware and jewellery for sale, but they're clearly making things as well, because they advertise to take apprentices and to buy a quantity of gold and silver. They're obviously at the centre of action in Bridgetown, because people are bringing them things to sell as well. They've intercepted what they think to be a stolen pair of silver-mounted spectacles, essentially appealing to the owners then to come and pay for the cost of the advertisement to get the goods back. But who is Smithson and who is James? Well, we'll deal with them one at a time. We were able to find a very good candidate for Smithson that we're confident in the silversmith based in Charleston, South Carolina, called George Smithson. He advertises in the South Carolina newspaper that he can make all kinds of jewellery, gold and silver work, including spoons, buckles, and so on. And he's clearly held in high regard because he's recruited to actually cut the Great Seal of South Carolina, shown on the right. But with the incoming American Revolution, Smithson, being a loyalist, leaves for the West Indies, as noted in a notice in the Gazette of the State of South Carolina. And that timing fits very well with him turning up in Barbados and then placing those advertisements just a few years later. He's the type of artisan that could do all this kinds of silversmith work and obviously train others to do so. But I couldn't figure out, with just the surname James, which is so common, who was James. And thank goodness Robert came to the rescue. If you remember Robert, I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, he actually, while I sadly didn't get to meet him, I was given access to some of his notebooks from a research trip he made to Barbados in the 90s. And Robert had copied out the details of a power of attorney for local Barbadian goldsmith Thomas Warwicker, which is witnessed by George Smithson, confirming who we thought it was on the previous slide, and Alexander James. So we then had a lead on James. And I can show you some silver. So these are a pair of salt cellars serving salt at the table. They're pedestal salts on a square base with a wonderful beaded rim and chased foliate and floral decoration. And they're marked on their base. The impression of the mark isn't so clear, but hopefully you can just about make out S&J for Smithson and James operating in Barbados. I can show you a much clearer impression of the mark on this soup ladle, so marked 3 times on the back with that lovely S&J mark for Smithson and James, and similarly on these tablespoons, which bear the same mark again 3 times on their undersides and crested and initialed with the owner's heraldry and initials. Smithson dies in Barbados in 1789, and it would appear that in 1788, presumably in his declining health, the firm of Smithson and James is superseded by that of Thomas and Alexander James. And so once we had the name of James, we were able then to find this advertisement. This advertisement only speaks to a retail trade of imported goods. However, there's very clear material evidence that this partnership continued to manufacture objects and offer them for sale, because we have here this absolutely wonderful set of 6 dessert spoons, bright cut decoration, marked on the back with a very fancy script mark for T and AJ for Thomas and Alexander James. And the quality of these spoons are exceptional, rival anything that was made in London. We find other bits of their work as well. So here's a big punch ladle marked with a different mark now in these block capitals, T and AJ for Thomas and Alexander James, with our lovely scallop bowl on the ladle, very attractive indeed. Conscious of time, we're coming on to the last family of goldsmiths that I'd mention, and it all started with coming across this ad in 1783 in the Barbados Mercury for goldsmith Isaac Campion, who's operating at his shop near Pullman's Corner. I haven't been able to figure out where Pullman's Corner is, so if anyone has any information on that, please do get in touch. Isaac Campion registers a will in Barbados, and it mentions his being a jeweler and goldsmith, but crucially that he leaves his shop working tools and glass cases to his sons, Conrad and Richard. So it's lovely to see mention of tools here, again, providing additional evidence that this was an active trade where people were actually making things. And it would also suggest then, if he was leaving his tools to his 2 sons, that they were somehow involved in the trade as well, likely goldsmiths themselves. And back to the family tree. So here our goldsmith Isaac Campion is in the middle. He leaves his tools to Richard and Conrad. Conrad's 2 children die very young, but 2 of Richard's children, out of several other children that he has, are goldsmiths. And this was a really nice moment because once I then clocked, this is where the genealogy helps us, once I'd arrived at the names of these children, those initials RWC stood out to me because I knew I'd seen a spoon somewhere on Barbados with that mark. And here it is for you. It's a teaspoon, later in style, stylistically probably about 1830, marked twice on its back, RWC for Richard Williams Campion Jr. We can also find the will in the Barbados Archives for Campion Jr., and it mentions his house to be sold together with the jewels in his glass case. And these references to glass cases, I believe, essentially are display cases, very typical of walking into a jeweler's of the period where you have fancy goods on display behind glass. And he leaves his tools and implements where he carried out his trade as goldsmith to his brother, Frederick Arthur Campion. So by doing this research on the Campions, we're seeing a really nice example of kin-based apprenticeship, where these skills are being passed down through successive generations on the island. And so it's going to be training within families in these skills. His brother, Frederick Arthur, I don't have any silver to show you yet for Frederick Campion. He actually dies in Philadelphia. And so I think that's another important point to note, is that there was some mobility of these artisans, and they were mobile throughout the islands, but also those coastal American states as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to start to wrap up here. I hope I've shown you that it's likely a retail market dominated, as successful people in Barbados wanted to pursue those sort of luxury goods coming out of Europe, but there were clearly also active craftspeople on the islands making and selling their wares. We've identified some of these goldsmiths and attributed some work to them. Stay tuned for more. I hope that as the years go on, we'll be able to identify more work. But progression of this project will absolutely rely on collaboration, not just with other academics and museums, but collectors and just members of the public. And so I just want to say briefly a little bit of how you can help. Just 2 more slides. Do check your drawers and cabinets. If you have silver objects at home, maybe you have some Barbadian silver sitting in your collection. So you've seen an example or 2 of what the marks can look like. Feel free to email me photographs if you'd like opinions or help in identifying things that you might have in your collection. The thing that's really important in this kind of research is ephemeral sources. And there seems to be a dearth of surviving paper of the 18th century related to Barbados that I've come across so far. I mean, these are examples from London of a trade card and a bill head for 2 London goldsmiths. There must be similar paper evidence for Barbadian smiths. So again, if you've come across any references in your own research, perhaps by accident, I'd love to hear from you. In the interest of time, just to say a huge thank you to everyone who's contributed to this work. It wouldn't be possible without you. And I just want to highlight just one name in particular in the interest of time, which is Wynyard Wilkerson, who's been an absolutely incredible mentor for this work and has shared so willingly his knowledge and experience with me. But to everyone else who's contributed, and to you, the audience, for listening, thank you.
Thank you, Luke, for that fascinating look at the goldsmith trade. Thank you so much. I will definitely be checking my drawers when I get home. But the floor is now open for any questions. We will encourage you to type your question in the Q&A box, any comments in the chat, and if you so wish, and you want to make your questions on mic, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. So let's have a look to see if there are any questions. Actually, we have one from David O'Carroll. I have a gold signet ring mark CG and S9 875. Does this suggest a Barbadian goldsmith?
Thanks, David, for the question. And so I'm glad to see we already have the first person thinking about what they have in their collections. In this case, no, I don't think this is a Barbadian goldsmith. I suspect it's going to be 0.375 rather than 8. Depending on how the mark was struck, it might look like an 8, but it should be a 375. That refers to 9-carat gold. That's what the 9 is. Likely British-made ring, but happy to identify that for you if you want to send me an email with the mark. Just to answer Gloria's question, if I could jump in there, hopefully you can see if my screen is still sharing the email address on the slide. You'll be able to contact me via that Silver Society email address that I keep an eye on.
So look, we have another one. Okay, this person missed the first half. Whereabouts did the gold and silver come from?
That's a really, really good question.
Mm.
And so from my research so far, I believe that these local smiths are actually mainly reusing silver rather than importing fresh bullion. I think what they're doing is taking the coinage, of course, is precious metal in those days, whether gold or silver. And so they can melt that silver or gold down and kind of reuse it. But the same for objects. It's not uncommon across the world. If the fashion changes, you might have older silver that you brought with you that you can then melt down and repurpose. And that happens up to today. So the vast majority of it, I think, is happening that way. I suspect very little is being imported as kind of fresh bullion.
Yeah. Okay. While we're waiting for another question, Luke, did you ever come across any legislation that limited the use of either slave or free colored or black labor in the goldsmith trade?
Um, that's a really good question. Now, I think I'd have to check this, not in relation to Barbados, but my experience with sort of the history of the island and my kind of beginning of the journey with that. But I think I have come across something similar in the context of British goldsmithing and the apprenticeship system in Britain. So I'll try and dig that out for you. And sorry not to have a perfect answer on the spot, but it's a really important consideration. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, we have one from another Luke. A fantastic lecture, thank you. Following on from the previous question, given the theme, there was no assay office on Barbados. What do we know about the purity of the silver the local goldsmiths were working with?
Thank you. Another fascinating question. So I guess I spoke earlier about the fact that we talked about hallmarking and the importance of knowing the purity of the silver, and that being the whole appeal, that it was a highly pure silver object with the same alloy all the way through. I need to gather more data, but I have taken a small number of these Barbadian spoons to Goldsmiths Hall in London and had them tested by X-ray fluorescence to check the actual content of the metal. And they come back just over 90% silver, so just shy of that sterling standard, but still good stuff. They're not using low-grade silver. It is of an appropriate standard that you'd expect. So people were getting good quality silver in Bridgetown in the 18th century. Thanks for the question.
But we have another one from an anonymous attendee. When you mentioned 28 pounds for the indentured servants, who paid whom? Did this mean that the servant received 28 pounds per annum? This seemed rather a lot of money for that period.
I might be showing my ignorance here, but it's a good question. But I think, yes, I couldn't comment on the relative value. I'll have to look into that. But yes, I think the servant was paid that per annum. And so they often were then also, their voyage was covered from Britain to the West Indies as well. But it's a good point. I should just check that to make sure that it seems like a fitting amount or that I have got that the right way around.
Okay. Renee wants to know if you have noticed any of the Barbados-made silver or gold objects displayed in the British museums.
Yeah, so good question. And so I'll answer that more generally. So those of us who collect silver, desperately want to attribute everything we find. And so the problem with these objects is that they can often be misattributed at first. So the objects I've come across in museum collections generally that I believe to be of West Indian origin often are miscatalogued as something like Scottish provincial or American colonial. And so this is why it's important to pursue these projects and to publish these marks so that people can reassess their collections and correct any misattributions or attribute things that are just sitting in drawers because they're not sure where they came from. So I can't think off the top of my head of any in British museums. I've definitely come across pieces on the online catalogues of American museums that, I think are West Indian made.
Okay. Um, Okay, that is the last one for now.
I think we might have one
Oh,
more from
there's another,
David,
yes. Mhm.
concerning skills that enslaved people might have brought with them from Africa. And absolutely, there is a history of metalsmithing in Africa. And so, you know, whether these artisans all got to use those skills, I think unlikely some of them would have been deployed elsewhere in the island. But yes, I think there would have been skills brought from Africa. Yeah.
Right, okay. Let me see if we have others. Yes, we do. Julie, Mexican. Was there a significant goldsmith business in Jamaica or Trinidad?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the really great question. I think essentially throughout all the islands, they're going to be different scales, but yes, I mean, I've looked into other islands as well, including Trinidad, and found references to gold and silversmiths. The only one I can kind of comment on confidently is Jamaica, to say that there was a huge goldsmith business in Jamaica, and the quality of what was produced there is absolutely outstanding. Some really early pieces coming out of Jamaica. The National Museums of Scotland have actually recently inherited, through Robert Barker when he died, a collection of Jamaican silver that has now been photographed and is on their website, and is currently being researched. But yeah, Barbados wasn't alone in this. I think, again, anywhere where there's sort of financial success, where sugar was successful and there was money coming in, people wanted these objects, and so it created that market for the trade.
Then we have another one from Luke. You mentioned that Bridgetown was the main center for production on the island, but is there any evidence to suggest goldsmiths working in the other towns too?
Yeah, and it's been a bit of a blind spot thanks for the question. Bit of a blind spot in my study, in that I've very much focused in on Bridgetown and St. Michael's, where the records are very good. I have come across references to goldsmith and watchmakers in Speightstown. Names off the top of my head, Bailey and Fenty from memory. But these, I need to look more closely into other town centres. Where these exist, it's going to be to a much smaller scale than in Bridgetown. But a really good question. No, it wouldn't have been limited to Bridgetown. There would have been some activity elsewhere. And Speightstown is an obvious place to look next. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we did answer David's question
Yeah.
about whether enslaved Africans brought relevant skills with them. Yes, yes. I don't
Yeah,
think,
we did.
yes, we mentioned, you did answer that, didn't you, Luke?
I did. Thanks, Harriet.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Is there, while we're waiting for another question, is there anything else that you would like to mention that you might not have mentioned in the slide?
Well, really, just again, that appeal for help. I mean, I'd love to work collaboratively with everyone on the call on this. And I think in people's own research and other topics, they likely have sort of, by the way, come across references to goldsmiths or silversmiths or jewelers on the island. And so just to say, if you do come across these again, I'd love you to write to me. I'd love to explore these with you. Again, if anyone has any objects that they'd like to know more about, whether it turns out to be Barbadian or not, it'd be lovely just to engage with people about their collections and share my knowledge of silver. And if I can't answer the question, I can probably find someone who can. So happy to help whenever I can. But it's really been such a pleasure just to share the progress to date, and hopefully we can have an update lecture in due course, maybe in a few years' time.
Yes, we look forward to that. You actually have a potential collaborator here, Linda Lewis. She said Bailey was generational, and I am researching this currently. So
Thanks
I
so much,
assume this
Linda.
is
I'll be
Louis
in
Bailey.
touch. Yeah.
So, Linda, you can take a note of Luke's email address on the screen, and you
Thank you
can
so
have a
much.
word with him. Yes. Okay, I think we have reached the end of the questions. So I want to thank you so much, Luke, for sharing your information. This has been really fascinating. And the fact that you have mentioned the involvement of Black and colored Barbadians in this trade, not only in ownership, but also in manufacture, I think is really important because it shows the diversity of skills in the set. You know, sometimes we kind of pigeonhole groups. So thank you so much for this. And I want to thank our audience for being so engaged. The questions, I'm sure that if you have any follow-up questions, you can contact Luke, or you can also contact me at library@barbnews.org.bb. So thank you so much. I want to thank Natalie for the early introduction. She had to leave the meeting quite early, but I want to thank her and wish her a good holiday. So thank you all again. Thank you, Anastasia, for keeping us on point technically. And we look forward to an update, Luke. And we also look forward to meeting everyone online again in September when we have our next meeting. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.